Hey there pilots, this is Dauntless Sam, and today we'll be looking at the history of the Grumman F4F Wildcat and its flight characteristics in War Thunder. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was an American carrier-based fighter aircraft that began service with both the United States Navy and the British Royal Navy in 1940. First used in combat by the British in Europe, the Wildcat was the only effective fighter available to the United States Navy and Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater during the early part of World War II in 1941 and 1942. The disappointing Brewster Buffalo was withdrawn in favor of the Wildcat and replaced as units became available. With a top speed of 318 miles per hour, the Wildcat was still outperformed by the faster 331 mile per hour, more maneuverable, and longer-ranged Mitsubishi A6M0. But the F4F's ruggedness, coupled with tactics such as the THAC weave, resulted in an air combat kill-to-loss ratio of 5.9 to 1 in 1942 and 6.9 to 1 for the entire war. Lessons learned from the Wildcat were later applied to the faster F6F Hellcat, which, with the exception of range, could outperform the Zero on its own terms. The Wildcat continued to be built throughout the remainder of the war to serve on escort carriers, where larger and heavier fighters could not be used. Grumman fighter development began with the two-seat Grumman FF biplane. The FF was the first United States naval fighter with retractable landing gear. The wheels retracted into the fuselage, leaving the tires visibly exposed, flush with the sides of the fuselage. Two single-seat biplane designs followed, the F2F and the F3F, which established the general fuselage outline of what would become the F4F Wildcat. In 1935, while the F3F was still undergoing flight testing, Grumman started work on its next biplane fighter, the G-16. At the time, the United States Navy favored a monoplane design, the Brewster F2A-1, ordering production early in 1936. However, an order was also placed for Grumman's G-16, given the Navy designation XF4F1, as a backup in case the Brewster monoplane proved to be unsatisfactory. It was clear to Grumman that the XF4F1 would be inferior to the Brewster monoplane, so Grumman abandoned the XF4F1, designing instead a new monoplane fighter, the XF4F2. The XF4F2 would retain the same fuselage-mounted, hand-cranked landing gear as the F3F, with its relatively narrow track. The overall performance of Grumman's new monoplane was felt to be inferior to that of the Brewster Buffalo. The XF4F2 was marginally faster, but the Buffalo was more maneuverable. It was judged superior and was chosen for production. After losing out to Brewster, Grumman completely rebuilt the prototype as the XF4F3, with new wings and tail and a supercharged version of the Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp radial engine. Testing of the new XF4F3 led to an order for the F4F3 production models, the first of which was completed in February of 1940. France also ordered the type, powered by a Wright R1820 Cyclone 9 radial engine, but France fell to the Axis powers before they could be delivered, and the aircraft went instead to the British Royal Navy, christened the new fighter the Martlet. The United States Navy officially adopted the aircraft type on October 1, 1941, as the Wildcat. Both the Royal Navy's and U.S. Navy's F4F3s, armed with four .50 caliber machine guns, joined active units in 1940. On December 16, 1940, the XF4F3 prototype was lost under circumstances that suggested the pilot may have been confused by the poor layout of fuel valves and flap controls, and inadvertently turned the fuel valve to off immediately after takeoff, rather than selecting flaps up. This was the first fatality in the type. Even before the Wildcat had been purchased by the United States Navy, both the French Navy and the British Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm had ordered the Wildcat, with their own configurations. The Wildcat was taken on by the British Fleet Air Arm as part of an interim replacement for the Fairey Fulmar. The Fulmar was a two-seat fighter with good range, but at a performance disadvantage against single-seater fighters. Navalized Supermarine Spitfires were not available because of the greater need of the Royal Air Force. In the European theater, the Wildcat scored its first combat victory on Christmas Day, 1940, when a land-based Martlet destroyed a Junkers Ju-88 bomber over the Scapa Flow naval base. This was the first combat victory by a U.S.-built fighter in British service in World War II. The type also pioneered combat operations from the smaller escort carriers. 6 Martlets went to sea aboard the converted former German merchant vessel HMS Audacity in September of 1941, and shot down several Luftwaffe FW-200 Condor bombers during highly effective convoy escort operations. These were the first of many Wildcats to engage in aerial combat at sea. The British received 300 Eastern Aircraft FM-1s as the Martlet 5 in 1942 and 43, and 340 FM-2s as a Wildcat 6. In total, nearly 1,200 Wildcats would serve with the FAA. By January 1944, the Martlet name was dropped, and the type was identified as Wildcat. In March 1945, Wildcats shot down 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s over Norway, the FAA's last victory with a Wildcat. The last air raid of the war in Europe was carried out by Fleet Air Arm aircraft in Operation Judgment Kilbotten on May 5, 1945. 28 Wildcat 6 aircraft from Naval Air Squadrons 846, 853, and 882, flying from escort carriers, took part in a successful attack on a U-boat depot near Harstad, Norway. 2 ships and a U-boat were sunk with the loss of 1 Wildcat and 1 Avenger torpedo bomber. In the Pacific, the Wildcat was generally outperformed by the Mitsubishi Zero, its major opponent in the early part of the Pacific theater, but held its own partially because the Grumman's airframe could survive far more damage than its lightweight, unarmored Japanese rival. Many United States Navy fighter pilots were also saved by the Wildcat's ZB homing device, which allowed them to find their carriers in poor visibility, provided they could get within the 30-mile range of the homing beacon. In the hands of an expert pilot, using tactical advantage, the Wildcat could prove to be a difficult foe even against the formidable Zero. After analyzing Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bureau reports describing the new carrier fighter, USN Commander Jimmy Thatch devised a defensive strategy that allowed Wildcat formations to act in a coordinated maneuver to counter a diving attack called the Thatch Weave. 4 United States Marine Corps Wildcats played a prominent role in the defense of Wake Island in December of 1941. USN and USMC aircraft formed the fleet's primary air defense during the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, and the land-based Wildcats played a major role during the Guadalcanal campaigns of 1942 through 1943. It was not until 1943 that more advanced naval fighters capable of taking on the Zero on more even terms, the Grumman F6F Hellcat and Vought F4U Corsair, reached the South Pacific theater. The Japanese ace Saru Sakai described the Wildcat's capacity to absorb damage as such. I had full confidence in my ability to destroy the Grumman, and decided to finish off the enemy fighter with only my 7.7mm machine guns. I turned the 20mm cannon switch to the off position and closed in. For some strange reason, even after I poured about 500 or 600 rounds of ammunition directly into the Grumman, the airplane did not fall, but kept on flying. I thought this very odd. It had never happened before, and closed the distance between the 2 airplanes until I could almost reach out and touch the Grumman. To my surprise, the Grumman's rudder and tail were torn to shreds, looking like an old torn piece of rag. With his plane in such condition, no wonder the pilot was unable to continue fighting. A Zero, which had taken that many bullets, would have been a ball of fire by now. Grumman's Wildcat production ceased in early 1943 to make way for the newer F6F Hellcat, but General Motors continued producing Wildcats for both United States Navy and Fleet Air Arm use. At first, GM produced the FM-1, identical to the F4F4 but with 4 guns. Production later switched to the improved FM-2 based on Grumman's XF4F8 prototype, optimized for small carrier operations with a more powerful engine and a taller tail to cope with the increased torque. From 1943 onward, Wildcats equipped with bomb racks were primarily assigned to escort carriers for use against submarines and attacking ground targets, though they would also continue to score kills against Japanese fighters, bombers, and kamikaze aircraft. Larger fighters such as the Hellcat and the Corsair and dedicated dive bombers were needed aboard fleet carriers, and the Wildcat's slower landing speed made it more suitable for shorter flight decks. In the Battle of Samar, on October 25, 1944, escort carriers of Task Unit 77-4-3 and their escort of destroyers and destroyer escorts found themselves as the sole force standing between vulnerable troop transport and supply ships engaged in landing on the Philippine island of Leyte and a powerful Japanese surface fleet of battleships and cruisers. In desperation, lightly armed Avengers and FM-2 Wildcats resorted to tactics such as strafing ships, including the bridge of the Japanese battleship Yamato, while the destroyers and destroyer escorts charged the enemy. Confused by the fierce resistance, the Japanese fleet eventually withdrew from battle. In all, 7,860 Wildcats were built. During the course of the war, Navy and Marine F4Fs and FMs flew 15,553 combat sorties, 14,027 of these from aircraft carriers, destroying 1,327 enemy aircraft at a cost of 178 area losses, 24 to ground shipboard fire, and 49 to operational causes. True to their escort fighter role, Wildcats dropped only 154 tons of bombs during the war. In War Thunder, there are two versions of the Wildcat, the F4F3 and the F4F4. The F4F3 is a Rank 1 aircraft with a battle rating of 2.0. It has a maximum speed of 499 km per hour, a turn time of 20.1 seconds, and a rate of climb of 11.8 meters per second, and has a primary armament of 4 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with 1,400 rounds. The F4F4 is a Rank 1 aircraft with a battle rating of 2.3. It has a maximum speed of 499 kilometers an hour, a turn time of 21.2 seconds, and a rate of climb of 10.6 meters per second, and has a primary armament of 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with 1,440 rounds. Both variants can be loaded with two 100-pound bombs. The Wildcat is a very potent fighter, with a good turn time for an American fighter. It is important to use boom and zoom tactics as the aircraft is very good at energy retention characteristics. If you need to, the Wildcat's maneuverability can get you out of trouble when up against German and Russian aircraft. I hope that this information has proved helpful. If you liked the video, please do like the video. If you would like to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and if you think anyone else would be interested in this video, don't be afraid to share it. This is Dauntless Sam. Thanks for watching.